Knox, Cedar, Antelope, northern part of Pierce, and most of Dixon County.
Thank you.
Also assisting us are our committee pages, Logan Burtek from Norfolk, who is a political science and criminology major at UNL, and Isabel Cole from Omaha, who is a political science and pre-law major. Don't go to law school. This afternoon, we will be hearing 5 bills, and they will be taken up in the order that is listed outside the room. On the tables to the side of the room, next to that column, you will find a blue testifier sheet. If you are planning to testify today, please fill one out and bring it to the pages so we can have accurate records. If you do not wish to testify but want your presence to be known and your position on a bill to be known, you can fill out the gold sheet over by the same column. Also, I will note that it's the legislator's policy that all letters of record must be received by the committee by noon the day prior to the hearing. Handouts, please make sure you hand them to the page. We can make sure we have 10 copies. If you don't, we will make sure we give you additional copies. Testimony for each bill will begin with the introducer's opening statement. After the opening statement, we will hear from any supporters of the bill, then followed by those in opposition, followed by those speaking in neutral capacity. The introducer of the bill will then be given an opportunity to close. You may see senators who are not here or come and go. If you don't know, we're having hearings in other hearings in other rooms, so senators may be leaving to go to a different hearing. We will also be using the 3-minute light system. So when you come up, please spell and state your name and spell those for the record. Then the 3 minutes will begin and you will be able to see with the green light. Then when it turns yellow, we'll have 1 minute left. And when it's red, we will wrap up your thoughts. I would like to remind everyone, including the senators, please turn off your cell phones or put them on vibrate. And we will begin today's hearing with LB 49. Senator Duncan.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chair Wayne and members of the Judiciary Committee. I'm Senator George Dungan, Georgedungan. I represent the people of Northeast Lincoln in Legislative District 26. Today I'm introducing LB 49. Colleagues, growing up in Nebraska, I've noticed there's always a couple of weeks or days in February where the temperatures get up to about 50 degrees or 60 degrees, and we start to think it's spring. And then inevitably there is a cold snap. Some call that false spring, second spring, third spring. It happens multiple times. And then all of a sudden the temperatures plummet all the way back down, and here we are in winter yet again. Today, although it's very, very cold out, the sun is still shining, showing that even on the coldest of days, I think we can all benefit from the sun. We know there's an ever-growing need for renewable and green energy. Solar and wind energy can supplement or provide a viable alternative to domestic and imported fossil fuels. Moreover, solar and wind energy are virtually inexhaustible, highly cost-effective, and good for the environment. No one worries about solar energy polluting the groundwater, harming air quality, and things such as that. As such, there is a need to enhance and protect access to these energy resources, should Nebraskans try to utilize them. Currently, however, Nebraskans face an impediment to choosing solar energy. One of those is that homeowners associations or other similar associations and sometimes property owners can restrict and prohibit inhabitants from installing solar panels. LB 49 would disallow these entities from barring the installation of solar energy collectors and prevent them from blocking direct sunlight to solar panels, at least as a consideration for zoning. Furthermore, at present, there is no recompense for Nebraskans who are unduly prevented from accessing solar energy in this way. LB 49 rectifies the situation by allowing recourse through civil action. It's important to understand that in no way does LB 49 change the approval process for exterior modifications, except that solar panels cannot be explicitly and contractually prohibited. In this way, LB 49 grants Nebraskans greater freedom of choice without significantly interfering with HOAs or other owner entities. If you ask me, it's a win-win situation. It's a small change for big gains, and while it's bitterly cold outside today, we can still appreciate the sunshine, and those individuals who decide to have solar panels on their houses can directly benefit from them as well. I also passed out an amendment. You'll see that. It does a couple of things. One of them substantive, one of them is simply cleanup. The first part of the amendment specifically says that this is not directed, nor should it be interpreted to invalidate contracts that have to do with conservation land easements. I spoke with individuals who work with conservation land easements, and they were concerned that some of their contracts, which go back 100 years old, don't have severability clauses and things such as that. So they had concerns that the language in this bill would effectively nullify conservation land easements, which is not an intention that I had when I wrote this bill. The second part of the bill just modifies some of the formatting to make it clearer. That's not a substantive change. I'm happy to answer any questions anyone might have. I will say that I have a bill up in appropriations here very soon that I want to make sure I can open on there as well. I'll try to stick around for closing, but if I am gone for closing, that's why.
So what you're saying is appropriation giving you money is more important.
That is not what I'm saying.
Oh, okay. I was just checking.
And I would apologize if it came off that way.
No, you're fine. I would go to appropriations too. Any questions from the committee? Senator Decay.
Thank you, Senator Wayne. Thank you, Senator Duncan. Does this just apply to houses, or does this apply to large solar arrays that cities and towns are proposing putting in?
So that's a good question. What this gets at, and specifically on page 3, line 27, subsection 2, says any instrument governing or regulating the ownership or use of real property which purports to prohibit or outright restrict the installation of solar panels, so on and so forth. So we're talking about real property, but yeah, any instrument that is governing or regulating the ownership of that real property cannot specifically prohibit or purport to restrict the use of solar panels. And I think you actually bring up a good point here that I want to highlight. One of the questions that I've received a lot about this bill is whether this sort of stops or prohibits landlords or other individuals from being able to dictate what happens on the property they own. I don't believe it does. The way that I intended this language to be written is that a lease, for example, can still have a provision in it that says a tenant cannot build on this property or further improve the property without prior approval of the landlord. That's still permissible. What it cannot do is specifically say you cannot put solar panels on the property. And the reason we're trying to make it that way is we feel as though there's too many covenants right now, specifically in some homeowners associations agreements and things like that, which you'll hear about from testifiers after me, that specifically prohibit these. And we want to be incentivizing Nebraskans to utilize these on their personal property or on homes or apartments if it's something they can benefit from. But if a landlord, for example, or homeowners association wants to say that you cannot build on or improve on your property without prior approval from the HOA or from the landlord, they can do that. It just can't specifically cut out solar panels.
So how will this work in conjunction, say, with their local power company like OPPD, LAS, MPPD, whoever, on the days that sun isn't shining, if it's cloudy? How does that work into the rate structure as far as paying for the infrastructure that's being used and the generation, the electricity that's coming into those apartments, homes, whatever, on the days that so that it's fair and equitable for everybody involved?
I think that's a really good question, and I know that's a question that comes up oftentimes with solar energy in general. I'll admit to you that I'm not probably the best person to answer that direct question as it pertains to sort of the ratepayer rates and how they're modified. I do know that we're talking about different kinds of solar here, right? So there are some solar panel arrays that, like you talked about, collect and then put back into the grid, and that can affect the overall energy. There's also a vast majority of the ones that we're talking about here, which are solar panels or energy collecting devices that directly go towards the home or the unit that they're attached to and don't give back into the general grid. And so I don't have a direct answer for you because I don't know the exact breakdown of the percentages of ones that go directly to the home versus ones that go back into the grid. But I'd be happy to speak more with some of the power companies, LES, and find out the effects this might have and get back to you on that. There might also be some of them here today, and they might be able to answer that. But to be honest, I don't have a specific answer for you.
I'm pretty sure there'd be somebody from either side of this issue that will be able to answer that going forward. And I just want to bring it up so people would be able to respond to that going forward.
I think that's a great question, and I appreciate that.
Thank you, sir.
Are there other questions for this testifier? For Senator Duncan?
I'll answer to whatever, it's fine.
I don't see any. Thank you, Senator Duncan. We'll hope that we get through this and you can stay in close.
Thank you.
First proponent testifier.
Thank you for the time to hear my testimony. My name is Deborah Nicholson. I am in District 29 in Lincoln. I am testifying today on behalf of the Lincoln chapter of Citizens Climate Lobby, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan grassroots organization focused on policies that will address climate change. CCL Lincoln supports the right of property owners to install and use solar panels without interference from homeowners associations or similar regulatory bodies. Solar panels on residential roofs are extremely efficient and effective for providing electricity to our homes and fueling our electric vehicles. I recently got bids for installing solar panels on my roof. It's expensive initially, but I believe it's the right thing to do, and in time, solar will yield a positive return on my investment. As a retired city planner, I do believe regulation of solar panels can avoid conflicts between neighbors. For example, homeowners should have the right to install solar panels on their roofs, but to maintain residential neighborhood character, required setback from right-of-way and lot coverage limitations should apply. This bill also proposes to authorize solar permits that would prevent vegetation from blocking direct solar access. Shade trees and windbreaks, however, moderate climate, keeping our homes and neighborhoods comfortable and inviting. Trees and other vegetation are also important bird and insect habitat and a source of food. I question whether limiting vegetation for solar access in residential areas is reasonable. I have tried to minimize the use of fossil fuels in my entire adult life. Back in 1973, when I was 20 years old, the Middle East stopped selling us oil, and we Americans quickly had to find a way to address the 10% decrease in our fuel supply. Presidents Nixon, Ford, and Carter responded to the crisis by establishing the Department of Energy and pushing an agenda of efficiency and conservation. Today, 50 years later, we can solve our energy problems without requiring us to sacrifice creature comforts or giving up our cars. Just when the world cannot tolerate any more carbon emissions from burning coal, oil, and gas, solar and wind can take their place. I hope that Nebraska will embrace, support, and benefit from clean energy. I guess that's all I'll say. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any questions from the committee? Can you spell your name for the record?
DebraNicolson.
Thank you. Senator Decay.
Thank you. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
Quick question, with different homeowners associations and different cul-de-sacs and stuff in the town, how will, if it's not in compliance, how do you work around those issues where, when they're dealing with everything from types of shingles to everything else, and then you're wanting to put a solar panel on top of those, how do you work through those issues within the homeowners associations going forward?
Well, I have a background in city planning. We did not deal with homeowners associations. They were a separate entity, regulatory body. But I think the city, any city jurisdiction in Nebraska could figure out a way to, first of all, allow solar panels, and then to provide specific regulations on characteristics. For instance, you don't really want them right up by the sidewalk. You want them maybe behind, not in the front yard. You don't want them too close to the property lines. And maybe you don't want them to fill the complete, the whole yard. But they can limit the amount of coverage. So I think that would be a way of addressing it. And homeowners associations could use the same sort of requirements, I would say. And that way it would allow people the use of their private property for solar, and also, make sure the neighborhood character is preserved. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, from the city, I guess from the commercial side of it, but I was talking more about the residential side where they have different specifics on type of shingles, the brick, wood houses, whatever. That's where I was trying to make sure that everybody was in compliance with the same regulations of their charters.
Well, that's, and the purpose of this bill, as I understand it, is to say, make sure that homeowners associations are flexible enough to accommodate solar panels.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Yes.
Any other questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Next proponent. Welcome.
Senator Wayne and members of the committee, I appreciate the opportunity to be here. My name is Lori, Lorrie Benson, Benson. I'm here on behalf of and as chair of the Climate Action Team at First Plymouth Congregational Church in Lincoln. We support LB 49. In particular, we support prohibiting restrictions on installation of solar arrays on homes and other properties. Further, we support removing any such restrictions currently in existence. We understand, and I'll add, I personally understand as somebody who's practiced real estate and as a former city and county attorney, that there are laws and traditions regarding the ownership of property, both individually and in groups such as homeowners associations, to manage and use their property as they see fit. But those freedoms are not absolute and have changed over the years as the world has changed. For example, no homeowners association today would be permitted to ban a member of a particular race or religion from buying a property in the neighborhood, something that was once common. You can build a style of home or commercial building that you wish, but it must be in compliance with zoning ordinances and building codes. If you wish to change something about your structure, you may have to meet building codes that are more stringent than when you first acquired the property. Today, the prohibitions on adding a solar array to a home or other structure need to be as outdated as those prohibitions on race or religion. Solar panels are desirable to individuals who want safe, reliable, and inexpensive electricity, as well as those who want to reduce their carbon footprints. As a society, we benefit from such installations because they reduce the need to add more capacity to electric utilities, first by reducing the need for electricity by some customers, and second by adding to electricity available in a community through net metering. Many in Nebraska are concerned about taking ag land out of production and using it for solar or wind farms. The more solar we put on houses and other buildings, the less we'll need ag land for wind and solar. Now is the time to remove these restrictions because the cost of solar panels and storage continues to drop. At the same time, there are significant financial incentives available to property owners. For my group, as people of faith, we believe that we have a responsibility to address climate change as quickly as possible to help protect people and the planet. Removing barriers to solar installations is an important step toward that effort. Thank you for considering my comments.
Thank you. Any questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you for being here. Next proponent. Welcome to your Judiciary Committee.
Thank you, Senator Wayne. Good afternoon, Chairman Wayne and members of the Judiciary Committee. My name is Kenneth Winston, Kenneth Winston. I'm appearing on behalf of the Bold Alliance in support of LB 49. The Bold Alliance works to protect land, air, and water from pollution, as well as protecting fundamental American rights to own property. We work with farmers and ranchers to protect their property rights. We support the protection of private property rights guaranteed by both the Constitution of the United States and the Nebraska Constitution. We support LB 49 for two reasons. First, we support the right of property owners to use their property as they see fit, as long as it's for a lawful purpose, and installing solar panels is clearly a lawful purpose. Second, it's vital that more of our energy be generated by renewable sources, and rooftop solar represents a vast potential resource for generating electricity. This can reduce our carbon footprint, increase the stability of the grid, and help keep energy dollars in the state of Nebraska. In addition, more solar installations will provide good paying jobs and generate economic benefits for the communities of Nebraska. And we would respectfully request that LB 49 be advanced for consideration by the legislature. I'd be glad to respond to questions.
Any questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Next proponent. Welcome.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Good afternoon, Chairman Wayne and members of the Judiciary Committee. My name is Laurel Van Ham, Laurel, and my last name is two words, VAN, capital HAM. I'm here to speak on behalf of Nebraska Citizens Climate Lobby and because of my Christian commitment to tend and to keep creation. I want to start by acknowledging Senator Duncan for the herebys and thereofs and legalese that this bill plans to strike from the statute that alone gives the bill merit for us ordinary Nebraska citizens who try to understand what it is you do here in our state house. So my thanks to Senator Duncan. LB 49 is at its core a bill about freedom for homeowners. As the statute already states, the use of solar energy and wind energy in Nebraska is of such importance to the public health, safety, and welfare that the state should take appropriate action to encourage its use. I would argue that the generation of such energy in Nebraska is also essential to securing our economic well-being and passing on our famed good life to future generations. The world around us is rapidly transitioning from fossil fuels to a clean energy economy. I say around us because Nebraska is falling behind in making that transition. While we have tremendous potential to reap financial benefits by generating both solar and wind energy, we are sabotaging those opportunities with unnecessary regulations and even deliberate interference. Distributed solar energy, clean energy that's generated in close proximity to its point of use, is about as economical as you can get, and it's an increasingly popular choice for homeowners. While not impairing the use of zoning for the public good, this bill protects homeowners from unnecessary governmental regulations that would make their use of distributed solar energy impractical or even impossible. While not mandating use of distributed energy, it protects homeowners from HOA covenants that would limit their freedom to make benign decisions about use of their property. Solar energy, like Nebraska, may not be for everyone, but it makes good sense to keep that option open to anyone. Finally, we're all concerned about Nebraska's brain drain, the young people we have raised and educated here leaving our state because they want to live, work, and raise their children in places that are preparing for the future rather than clinging to the past. We can encourage those young people. I urge you to support and advance it. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you for being here. Next proponent.
Hello, Senator Wayne and the rest of the senators. Thank you for doing this day in and day out, listening to citizens and making laws. I'm Moni Usis, MoniUSASZ. I support LB 49, which would keep homeowners associations from prohibiting solar panels on homes. Adding solar should be a homeowner's decision. We need more solar in cities and towns, not less. Imagine each new subdivision with solar arrays on every roof. Imagine older homes retrofitted with solar. Renewable energy projects do not have to be clustered on public and private lands far from cities. Adding solar in towns, cities, and suburbs would add generation capacity without having to add more power lines and infrastructure. This would save us money. For example, how much power could be generated by slapping solar panels not only all over the West's vast parking lots, but also on its 21,000 big box store rooftops? A reporter at High Country News magazine recently asked that question and crunched the numbers. There were 21,363 big box stores, which could generate 31,035,098 megawatts from solar arrays. And that could power 3 million homes. But what if the homes already had solar arrays? And then I've given you the information as to where you can find the article. Urban and suburban communities should be producing megawatts of solar rather than depending on renewable energy based in the countryside. It's only fair. LB 49, which would allow homeowners to add solar without restrictions, is a small first step. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Any questions from the committee?
Yes.
Senator DeBoer.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. You live in the city,
Yes, I live in the city.
and you think that we should contribute as much from the city as as we ask our neighbors out in the rural parts?
I would definitely say that.
I agree. Thanks.
Any other questions from the, oh, all right. They're
It's
fine.
okay. Well,
Uh,
there'll be somebody else ask a question too.
Okay. Next proponent. Maybe not. Next proponent. Okay, moving on to opponents. Opponents.
My name is Rick, R-I-C-K, McDonald, M-C-D-O-N-A-L-D. I represent Metropolitan Omaha Property Owners Association in Omaha, Nebraska, and we're a group of 430 property owners in the Omaha area. We ask that you oppose this bill. This bill, if passed, gives the tenant too much control over the physical structure of the landlord's property by the installation of the solar panels. This bill gives the landlord no say in this matter as to how much damage might be done to the property from the installation. Landlords in the past have refused to let tenants install satellite dishes on the roof due to leakage from the screws driven into the roof. Installation of solar panels will make this problem even worse because of the massive structure of the solar panels. The tenants allowed to install these solar panels, who's responsible for the selection of the contractor who does the work? If the tenant chooses the lowest bid, and the landlord has no authority, there could be all sorts of issues with the installation. If there are problems with the solar panels themselves or the installation, who's responsible for the damage? The tenant or the landlord? If there's a hailstorm and the solar panels are damaged, who's responsible for the insurance coverage? The landlord or the tenant? If the solar panels are installed on an older existing roof, who's responsible for the removal of those solar panels and the reinstallation of those panels if the roof needs to be replaced? Who's going to inform the neighbor that his shade tree is blocking the sun from the solar panels and insist that he remove his tree? The landlord or the tenant? What's the landlord to do when the tenant moves out? Do the solar panels belong to the landlord or do they belong to the tenant? The bill is just one more in a large number of city, state, and federal regulations that is driving landlords out of the business and causing a shortage of affordable housing. By Omaha City Council's own words, Omaha is currently 7,000 rental units short just over the last several years and continues to drop. At this rate, the population in the shelters with homeless people will continue to grow as affordable housing drops. Thank you.
Any questions from the committee? Senator DeBoer.
Thank you for being here.
You bet.
I don't think that the introducer intended it to cover landlords. That doesn't mean that that's not what the green copy says. So if we made quite clear that the landlord would still have the ability to say, no, we can prevent you from putting solar panels on, would that get rid of your objection?
That would help. It does, I believe it does state in here that if it's in a lease, same as with an HOA. So we don't want the tenant to overrule the landlord. The landlord needs to keep control of his property.
And if it was just about HOAs, but not about landlord-tenant, and so the landlord could still control that, would that be okay with you?
Well, we just assumed that if the HOA has the authority in their regulations and stuff, in the past, it's been the HOA could overrule the city on something, but this would change that. But from our point of view, with our landlord association, what we're really concerned about is the landlord-tenant relationship and the rental property.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you for being here. Next opponent. Welcome.
Hello, good afternoon, Chairman Wayne and members of the Judiciary Committee. My name is Jill Becker, spelled Jillbecker, and I appear before you today representing Black Hills Energy and Northwestern Energy in opposition to the bill. We don't have concern about the majority of the provisions of the bill. Our concern begins on page 2 of the bill, lines 11 through 15. The new language in the bill that would make solar energy and wind energy within the police powers of the state and its municipalities. And we just think that is a stretch, and that it's really inappropriate to have those two energy sources within the police power of the state. We're not exactly sure what the intent of that is, or really the ramifications of it, but we are opposed to that piece of the bill. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Next opponent.
Good afternoon, Chairman Wayne and members of the Judiciary Committee. For the record, my name is Elaine Menzel, ELAINEMENZEL, here today on behalf of the Nebraska Association of County Officials, appearing in opposition to LB 49 at this point. I've not had an opportunity to review the amendments that Senator Duncan brought to your attention, but I believe most they had to deal with homeowners, but they perhaps would still address our concerns. I'm not sure. Our opposition is primarily related to additional responsibilities that the zoning administrators foresee that they may be engaged within. I think that they are something that could hopefully be easily remedied and through discussions with the senator. And so with that, just wanted to let you know that we'd be glad to work with the senator and the committee and hoping to address those issues. If there's any questions, I would attempt to answer them.
Any questions from the committee? Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Next opponent. Welcome.
Thank you, Chair Wayne and Senators. My name is Dennis, D-E-N-N-I-S, Tierney, T-I-E-R-N-E-Y. LB 49 creates a new right to direct sunlight that does not exist in the Constitution, Bill of Rights, or any amendment to the Constitution. Senator Dunnigan wants to put into law that this new right cannot be abridged by the presence of any shade from outside the owner's or tenant's property. Now, he stated that the tenants still would have to get permission to put up a solar panel to modify the building. However, that's, to my knowledge, there's nowhere stated anywhere in the bill. As it exists now, if a tenant wants to put a solar panel on a roof and the landlord has a tree that's shading the roof, the landlord could be sued by the tenant to remove the tree. If this is absurd in the extreme. It's been estimated that a tree shading a roof cuts air conditioning costs for the property by 5 to 15%. Trees also absorb greenhouse gases and provide oxygen. The bill does not have any provision for payment to a landlord for damages that could be caused by solar panel installation by the tenant. I have an apartment building that's been designated an historical landmark that has trees that shade it. As it exists now with this bill, the tenant could put up a solar panel on this building, and that would immediately take the building off the historical landmark because it would significantly alter the appearance of the building. The thousands of dollars we put into this building to keep it a historical landmark, to keep it as an asset for the community, would be negated because of this solar panel. That this bill also does not limit the so-called right to direct sunlight to just solar panels. There is no limitation on this right to direct sunlight. Someone could conceivably extend this right to be able to have direct sunlight come in their windows so they can have passive solar heating, or just enjoy the sunlight however they wish. Someone with SAD syndrome could force the landlord or the neighbor to remove shade trees to maximize their exposure to direct sunlight. Due to the lack of limits of this, what this new right entails, this bill is fraught with all sorts of potential unintended consequences. Senators, please reject this ill-considered bill. Thank you.
Any other questions from the committee? Any questions? Seeing none, thank you for being here. Next opponent.
Chairman Wayne and members of the committee, my name is Justin Brady, Justin Brady. I appear before you today as the registered lobbyist for the Nebraska Realtors Association, for the Metro Omaha Builders Association, and the Home Builders Association of Lincoln in opposition to LB 49. All these three associations that are just listed off are not opposed to solar or wind. What they're looking at is a state or government's role is to lay out, some parameters. When you start getting into HOAs and leases and agreements, those are private agreements. And now you as a state are being asked to step in and void those private agreements. People bought homes, sold homes, they have leases, or it's even commercial space based on the neighborhood, the surroundings around them. And they went in with knowledge, and by our state law, there has to be a disclosure of the HOA. There, you have to sign off on it. You have to initial that you received it. So what I didn't hear from anybody in the proponent side say is, we didn't know it was there and we tried to put up a solar panel. It was, yes, we knew it was there, and now we would like to change it. And so what from these associations understand is you're looking at trying to change the private agreement. And I'll give one example. So when you go back to talk about the direct sunlight. So if you had a development and I went in and built a ranch home and I put solar panels on it, and one of you came along and were going to be my neighbor to the south, say, and you wanted to put a 2-story. If that directly impacts my son on my roof branch for my solar panels, you are prohibited from putting a 2-story home on your new lot that you just built because it would violate this law. So for those reasons, we would ask that you not advance LB 49. That'll try to answer any questions.
Any questions, Senator? Good.
Thank you, Senator Wayne. Thank you, Mr. Brady. Maybe I got a couple questions. Number one, when it comes to, it was stated earlier about whole subdivisions maybe be able to build. There's going to be infrastructure costs that are going to have to be accumulated, prorated out to ratepayers throughout the cities or neighborhoods through their public power distributors. Because, yeah, we can make a whole subdivision solar. On the days that the sun isn't shining, how are those houses going to be powered without existing infrastructure, and how's that going to affect ratepayers throughout the whole system and the ratepayers that are building these homes to use those facilities on the days that they actually need them?
Well, not here representing any of the generators, if you will, of electricity or power, but I would tell you it's going to obviously, I would see it as increasing the cost. I mean, yes, because you would have a number of places where you would have to still install all that. Typically, any backbone, whether you take it in the, electronic or electricity or telephone or cable, you have a cost to lay that network. And that cost is based on everybody using it. So yeah, if all of a sudden they aren't using it, you still have to put the backbone in. Users just aren't going to use it. But that's,
And, the other part, my other part of the question for all of this is if you get into a large commercial business or something that wants to use basically a small solar array for their business, and it starts impacting net metering within the state, which is within the parameters of LES, OPPD, whoever, MPPD, whoever, those costs, how are they going to be prorated out throughout the ratepayers of this state too? Because like I said, the infrastructure's got to be there. Those costs have got to be picked up, and for the days that they aren't buying generation from those facilities, those facilities are still running on the days that they do need them. So that's just part of the infrastructure cost that I think needs to be put into the whole balance of this bill going forward.
no, I understand what you're saying.
Any questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you for being here. Next opponent. Next opponent. Anybody testifying in neutral capacity? Neutral capacity.
Senator Wayne, members of the Judiciary Committee, my name is Bill Hawkins, Billhawkins. I'm a lifelong Nebraskan and an environmentalist most of my life. I have lived without a lot of electronic energy. And so there has been a lot of proponents and opponents on each side with some very good information for you. I started my life as a tree planter in the great state of Nebraska, and so I'm a landscaper. And so one of the points of this bill is the issue that it is in the Judiciary Committee instead of the Natural Resource, where I've just testified on 2 solar wind bills just yesterday. And so that is one of my concerns, is it creates a police state and declares that, again, with solar and wind. That is a concern of mine. And as a landscaper and property owner, people aren't always practical when they demand solar. I've had people move into a neighborhood of huge giant shade trees and a property covered with shade trees, and then want to put up solar panels, and they don't have any sun, or they want to plant prairie grasses and the prairie doesn't grow in the shade. So that gives them the right to cut down trees for several lots. I caretake a historic house over here on 20th and Euclid, 3-story red stone built in the early 1900s. It has 70, 80-foot white pines on the north side that the early property owner planted. Right next to the property is a old folks home, if that's proper or not. But they're in dense shade all the time. If they decide they want to put up solar panels, then we have to take off half the building. And a lot of people don't realize that the sun at an angle is down from 30 degrees up to over 90 degrees. We are just coming out of the dead of winter. And so if you put solar panels up against a group of trees, and then all of a sudden in the winter, you don't have access to it. And so the other point I'd like to make real quick is, and I'm green energy as you can be, but solar panels and wind energy is not green. All these solar panels come from China under horrific conditions, and those are not produced green. There is a 7-year lifespan, and then they are toxic waste. The same thing with the wind energy.
Ask you to wrap up, Bill.
I am torn on this issue, but the key on this bill is distributive energy, which is to put solar panels in the town rather than big corporate wind farms. So I'd appreciate your great thought on this bill.
Thank you.
And I would take any questions.
Thank you. Any questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you for
Thank
being
you
here.
so very much.
Anybody else in a neutral capacity, neutral testifiers? Seeing none, as Senator Duncan waives closing, there were a total of 72 letters, 20 in support and 49 in opposition, and 3 in the neutral position. And that will close the hearing on LB 49, and we will open the hearing, maybe, on Senator John Kavanaugh. We'll open the hearing on LB 186. Senator John Kavanaugh, welcome to your Judiciary Committee. Welcome to your Judiciary Committee, Senator Kavanaugh.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Wayne and members of the Judiciary Committee. I actually have a handout here. My name is John Kavanaugh, John-Cavanaughh, and I represent the 9th Legislative District of Midtown Omaha, and I'm here today to introduce LB 186, the Unlawful Restrictive Covenants Modification Act. It creates a process to make it easier for landowners to remove unlawful and discriminatory restrictive covenants from their deed. Well into the 20th century, it was a common practice to include racially discriminatory language in contracts for the sale of land. These restrictive covenants would explicitly prohibit the sale on the basis of race, usually prohibiting sales to Black people. Together with the practice of redlining, these covenants contributed to generations of housing segregation. Today, these covenants are illegal, but both under Nebraska and federal law. The landmark Supreme Court case, Shelley versus Kramer in 1948, found that a court enforcing a racially restricted covenant violated the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. The Fair Housing Act of 1968 explicitly prohibits racially restricted covenants and redlining. The Nebraska Fair Housing Act prohibits any specification limiting the transfer, rental, or lease of any housing because of race, creed, religion, color, national origin, sex, disability, family status, or ancestry. Despite these prohibitions, many deeds still contain this illegal and unenforceable language, a vestige of time when they were common practices in real estate. Removing these covenants is a complicated and difficult process. LB 186 aims to make that process easier. It allows landowners to request for the County Register of Deeds to remove the unlawful restrictive covenant from a deed. The Register of Deeds would then record the modification and would be allowed to charge a fee no more than $10. The goal is to make it easy and inexpensive as possible. It's important to remember that the apparatus of the state was utilized to enforce this segregation for decades. So the apparatus of the state ought to have a responsibility to remove the vestige of that discrimination from the deeds. LB 186 is a small step towards correcting the historic injustice. I ask for the Judiciary Committee to advance LB 186, and I'd be happy to take any questions. And I would just point out the thing I handed out to all of you is a example of a restrictive covenant that is actually on a property title that was just searched in the city of Omaha within the last year. And so somebody provided this to me when I brought this bill. So this, if you look at this language, this is on titles in Omaha. I actually searched my title of my house because I didn't know, and it didn't have one of these, but there are countless residences, titles in Omaha that still have this type of language. So it is still very much an issue. And so I'd be happy to take any questions.
Any questions from the committee? Senator Holcroft.
Thank you, Chairman Wayne, and thanks for bringing the bill. I'm familiar with covenants for homeowners association, but I guess there are other covenants, and who can impose a covenant on a specific title?
Well, yeah, so this, it would be the landholder. I think a lot of these happened when it's kind of like homeowners associations back when they would develop land. And in the interest of keeping a neighborhood entirely white, the developer would put this language that I handed out onto the deeds before they would start sell them. And so they would they would sell exclusively to white families, but they would make sure that then those families couldn't transfer it to anybody of any other race. And so it's the original landholder. I think, really anybody could put it, you could put something onto a deed, like a lien or something like that. I assume you guys just had I think that was the hearing before this was those sort of covenants. But yeah, you can't do this now, but they're still just hanging out there on all of these old titles. And so this is really, they have no current effect other than the fact that if you live in your house and you search your title and it says that you shouldn't be living there, or you're not allowed to live there legally, I would find that offensive if that were me. And so I would want to take that off my title. And it shouldn't cost you a lot of money and a lot of time to do that.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions from the committee? Senator Decay.
Thank you. I apologize if I missed you saying this. This covenant that you had to hand out on, is that a new covenant or is that an existing covenant that was just brought forward to you in the last year?
So the handout that I circulated,
Right.
So that is an example of the covenants we're talking about, and this is on a property in Omaha. When I brought this bill, I just sort of put out into the ether and said, hey, has anybody found any of these? And somebody responded and sent me one from a title search they'd just done. So this is a house in Omaha that somebody I knew just transferred title on, and they did a title search and they looked at the title when they bought the house, and it was on there.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
Any other questions for the committee? See you then. Thank you for being here. We will open with proponents. Proponents. Welcome back.
Chairman Wayne and members of the committee, my name is Justin Brady, JUSTIN BRADY. I appear before you today as the registered lobbyist for the Nebraska Realtors Association, for the Metro Omaha Builders Association, and the Home Builders Association of Lincoln in support of LB 186. As Senator Kavanaugh explained, from both realtors and home builders standpoint, they look at these and they're not enforceable, but all of a sudden you have properties that are being transferred, and now you end up in a transaction where a buyer or a seller sees one of these on there and says, wait a minute, I don't want it. And then you have this situation where you're saying, it's not enforceable, trust me, they won't do anything. And it just becomes a nightmare for some, especially real estate agents, to have to explain that it shouldn't be there. And they all three associations fully agree it shouldn't be there. And so we think having a system to get them removed efficiently would be great. So with that, I'll try to answer any questions.
Any questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Next proponent. Welcome. Great shirt, great color.
Thank you. Same. Good afternoon. My name is Spike Eichholt, SPIKEEICKHOLT. Thank you, members of the committee. I'm here on behalf of the ACLU of Nebraska. Just want to thank Senator John Kavanaugh for introducing the bill. You got my statement, so I'm not going to read from it. I think Senator John Kavanaugh missed his introduction because I was in another committee. But I think he probably mentioned some of the history that we've had in our state. Basically, on the case level, at the federal level, the U.S. Supreme Court found in 1947 these types of restrictive covenants are unconstitutional. And in my statement, I've actually attached some statutes from the Nebraska Fair Housing Act. And if you look at that attachment on the second page, our current law that was passed in 1991, section 20-317, specifically prohibits restrictive covenants based on race, religion, color, national origin, sex, and other suspect factors. And what this bill does is it provides for a process for removing some of those prior restrictive covenants that were imposed or that were placed on deeds before enactment of this law, or that may have been somehow drafted either by association or some similar transfer of title that are simply unenforceable due to our current law. I just want to be on record of supporting this. We want to be on record supporting it. I'll answer any questions if anyone has any.
Any questions from the committee? Senator DeKay.
Since you're new here, can you spell Spike one more time for me? I'm just kidding.
We even got a chair for him right there.
Thank you. It's spelled on the chair.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you for being here. Any other proponents? Any opponents? Anybody testifying in a neutral capacity? As Senator Kavanaugh comes up to close, we have 2 letters for the record, one in support and one in neutral.
I don't have anything to add. I just, in case anybody had any questions, I'd be available, but.
Any questions? Senator Iba.
Thank you very much. So when I was reading Spike's information, if this is already in place, the discrimination, or what does this fix?
So, thank you for the question, Senator Iba. That's a great question. So the covenants themselves have no effect, no legal effect, but they're still on the paper. So if you go and get a copy of your title from your property, it might have a lot of things listed on it, and one of them might be that covenant that I handed out.
Okay.
And so it would still be on the title. It just doesn't have any effect. And so the purpose of the bill is to say, if you don't want that on your title, it should be easy to get it off of there, because it's a legacy of our discrimination that we've done in this country. And this is one effort to make it easier and efficient and inexpensive for people to at least remove that portion of that discrimination.
So it would prevent HOAs from even putting this in the covenant,
Well,
even in?
Nobody can do this now.
Okay.
You couldn't add this to a property
Okay.
and it would have no effect. This is just to go back to any property that it was put on before 1948 or 1968 and say, you can take it off.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Thank you.
Any other questions from the committee? Seeing none,
Thank
thank you for being here. Not opposed to hearing on LB 186. And we'll open up the hearing on LB 394. Senator Erdman. Yeah, no problem. We'll take a short recess and wait for him.
Great.
Let's go ahead and get started. Senator Erdman, whenever you're ready.
Thank you. Thank you, Vice Chairman. I appreciate that, Chairwoman. This is the first time I've been in the Judiciary.
Oh.
So I'm Steve Erdman. That is spelled Steverdman. And I represent District 47. That's 9 counties in the Panhandle of Nebraska. So today I came to introduce LB 394. LB 394 has involves eminent domain, which I have been involved with for several years. I want to share a little story about the first experience I had with eminent domain was in 1999. The railroad that runs through my county had decided to build a new spur to go around a significant increase in their elevation. And they were going to use eminent domain to change the route that would make them more efficient. There were probably 60 landowners involved in that route. 20 or more had decided that they would just go along with the eminent domain request because no one ever beats the railroad. The route was going to go right through the middle of one of my pivots and was going to take out the well that I had spent thousands of dollars to try to discover where it should be. There were a lot of sleepless nights wondering whether that was going to happen or not. So fast forward, there was a bill introduced to restrict some of the eminent domain authority that railroads had. And several of the landowners in our area were busy like I was, having calves in the spring. We could not attend the hearing. And so several landowners did make the trip. And my son Philip was a junior at the University of Nebraska, and I asked him to testify. And when he concluded his comments, the people that had come from my district had suggested that perhaps he should be the senator. So I told you this story to tell you this, that shortly thereafter, he decided to run for the legislature, and a year and a half later was elected to serve in the 47th district, is where I'm serving now. So eminent domain is something that my family has dealt with or tried to deal with in the past. And so as I began to understand what eminent domain meant to my neighbors north of me when they built part of the Heartland Expressway this last 4 or 5 years, it's a difficult situation that you're asking someone to sell you something that they don't want to sell. And no matter what price it is, they don't want to sell that. And so as I began to think about this for the last several months, I began to think there should be some compensation above and beyond just the appraised value of whatever property they're taking. And they're going to construct, or they want to construct, a 4-lane highway that runs past my house. It'll either be on the north side of the highway, they will take an easement on the south side, and they will use eminent domain to do that. And if they go on the north side of the highway, they will take 13 residents. If they go on the south side, it's 19 residents. And so one of the issues that I want to share with you today is, what are they purchasing? What are they buying from you that you don't want to sell when they do such a thing? And so I have talked to people who've had their land condemned to build a school, their land condemned for other reasons that are supposed to be public purpose. They didn't want to sell it in the first place. And so what happens is if you don't agree with their analysis or their appraisal, then you get a hearing. And I've been to some of those hearings when they did the road north of my house, and they wind up getting whatever they decided to give them. And so my intention with this bill, and you can see what it says in there, that if you buy ag land, it should be double the appraised value. And I will share with you why I think it should be double. And if you are buying a facility, a house or such a building, it should be replacement cost. And so I want to pass out a couple of things that I'd like you to take a look at. And we will talk about these, and then I'll take your questions. But I think this is pretty self-explanatory. Pass that one out first, if you would. Again, have one of those, please. Just give me one. Okay. What you're going to see in this first document that I'm passing out, you're going to see a center pivot irrigation system that is near the highway. And as you take a look at that center pivot system, and by the way, I had this in black and white. I had this printed in black and white, and the esteemed chairman of this committee said, if you really want to make an impression, you need to have this in color. So last evening, my computer wouldn't print to the mailroom to get it in color, but I figured out with IT how to do this. So Senator Wayne, thank you for that advice. Okay, as you'll notice, the center pivot, and you can see it in the middle, it's not real plain, but the acreage in that center pivot is 125 acres. All right? So I went to the highway department's explanation of the land that they were going to purchase, and this stretch is about 18 miles wide, and they were going to purchase 200 acres of ag land all the way across that 18 miles. They didn't take into consideration what taking off 100 feet on the front of a pivot is. So I'm going to pass this second one out to you. And so that pivot equates to 125 acres of irrigated land. And then the second diagram, the second picture I'm going to show, thank you, is what happens if you shorten up a pivot 100 feet. And so what happens, and you'll see it in the picture when you get it, it shortens up the pivot 23 acres. Okay, it goes from 125 to 102 acres. All right, so the point is this, that outside of the pivot, that what you see, if you look at the two together, the difference in the size of the circle is about 23 acres. And so when they purchased the first 100 feet across the south side of that property next to the highway, they've shortened the pivot up 100 feet. So they give you the appraised value. The ag land in that area is probably worth $4,000 an acre. So they're going to pay this landowner $24,000 for the purpose of for the reason to buy that 6 acres. Remember, he didn't want to sell in the first place. All right, so what happens then is the person has to shorten the pivot 100 feet. That's several $1,000s to do that. Then he has to change the sprinkler package on his pivot to go from 750 gallons a minute to 650 gallons. That's another $6,000, $8,000. Then he has to change the pump that pumps the water because he can't pump 750. He only has to pump 650. So it could cost him $10,000 to $15,000 to retrofit his pivot to fit the area that he has once they purchase that land. So when you look at that outside area there, it's about 20%, 18% of the total. So it would be like every 7 years raising no crop at all. So you're going to take this land, you're going to pay him for the front piece of it, but you're going to put out of production for the rest of the time he owns that property or anybody else does, the production that's lost because they shortened up the pivot. Therefore, that's why I think that should be at least double the appraised price to make up for some of those adjustments he has to make to his pivot, as well as the loss of production he's going to have for the rest of the time he owns the property. Now, let's talk about the facility, the house that's on this property. And I want to show you this house. This is from the county assessor's website. And I apologize, this one's not in color, but I think it'll make the point just as well. This home is 2,550 square feet. It is a brick home, and it's right adjacent in your colored map. It's in the corner down where the little red mark is on the left-hand corner. That's where the building is. That's where the house is. So if they take 100 feet off of the front of this quarter, they're going to take that house. They're going to take that house. These people have lived there for a long time. They've spent work growing the trees and doing the things they do there. They don't want to live somewhere else. They want to live here. But they could possibly have to move and relocate. Now, one other thing I didn't tell you, these people also have a seed corn business, and it's in the buildings on the back side of that house. They live near where their seed corn business is. So they're going to force them to move somewhere else, to move to a location that's not convenient for them. And we're going to pay them the appraised price. So you see the value of the square footage of the house is 2,551 square feet. And in that area, generally houses are about $150 a square foot. So if you do the math, that's less than $400,000. It's around $385,000 appraised value for this house. In our area, to build another facility similar to this is going to cost $300. So what happens is they're going to give them the appraised value, $380. They've got to relocate this facility somewhere else, and it's going to cost them $800,000 to replace it. Now, they may not have a mortgage now, but they sure are going to if they want to have the same facility somewhere else. Those are the reasons why I think that the compensation for eminent domain needs to be considered at a replacement cost, not just an appraised value. And so you may hear from people who are in the area where they're planning on building a new lake. Some of those people may own that property for over 100 years. And if you can explain to me how much value there is, how much you can pay them to give up 100 years of tradition where they own that land. So the problem we have is, I'm not against eminent domain. The problem we have is the compensation method that we use to compensate people to buy something from them that they don't want to sell. And they say that we'll relocate you in a facility very similar to yours, but they don't understand I want to live here. I don't want to live somewhere else. And so you're asking them to give that up for the good of the public, for the appraised value. And so I ask you, if that were your house, what would you think? And so you will hear today from counties, from cities, railroads, whomever, use eminent domain, you will hear about this as unfair. And I thought it was a very, very good thing that the Department of Transportation give me the fiscal note of 7.5 million. I was impressed. I was hoping it was going to be 20 million. But what generally happens in these hearings is the departments kill things by a fiscal note. But this is great news for me. So here's why I say that it's great news. It's 7.5 million, and they say that's what it could cost the state if we implement this bill. Perfect. Here's why I say perfect. Because that is the amount that the general public is going to suffer in losses if we don't pass this bill. That's it right there. That is an underestimate of what it's going to be. So I appreciate the fiscal note. It proves my point. It proves the fact that they're taking this property from somebody, and they know that to replace that property is going to cost $7.5 million more, but they don't care. They don't care. We're going to take your property. Here's what we're going to give you. And even though you're going to have to suck it up and take up the $7.5 million loss, that's what they want to do. So I appreciate that fiscal note. I hadn't seen it until today, but I thought, wow, I told Joel, my staff, I said it should be 20 million. So you will hear from all those people that we're going to stop eminent domain and it won't happen again. I mean, we won't be able to use it again. Here's the point. The point is, treat these people fairly. The people don't want to sell what they have. You want what they have, and you need it to do whatever you need to do. Just compensate them, all right? And you'll hear the county come in, they'll say they may use eminent domain sometime, it could cost them more. When I was a county commissioner, we wanted to move a county road. So what I did, I went to the person who owned the land. I said, hey, you want to sell me 20 acres on the front of your property? And he said, I might. I said, what do you want for it? He told me. I said, sounds fair to me. We bought it. It was at least 50% more than it was worth on the open market. But he was happy. I was happy. And we made a deal. We moved the road. That's how you do it. So if somebody would want to sell something, then you have to think about what you're going to do next. But I can tell you right now that we take no consideration, zero consideration, into what burden and what conflicts we're putting these people in. Because I can tell you right now, these people that are living next to that highway, they're scared to death. They're scared to death what's going to happen. And they shouldn't have to live in fear. It's called private property, and it should have some rights that are guaranteed. And so I ask you to advance this bill, bring some civil, common sense approach to how you purchase land from people that don't want to sell.
Thank you. Any questions from the committee? Senator Decay.
Thank you, Senator Wayne. Thank you, Senator Erdman, for bringing this. First of all, I got to compliment you on staying within the lines when you were coloring last night. Would you agree with me that there could be different types of eminent domain? Obviously, there's the type that you are visiting about today, talking about today, where it's once it's used for highways, train right-of-ways, whatever, it's gone forever. A different type of eminent domain is to put structures there that aren't going to impact the size of the center pivot and stuff, but just gives a company ability to access that if they need to work on a structure or whatever, if it comes to that. But as far as physically shrinking the size of a pivot like you, and I agree with you, in some cases that's going to be with roads, railroad, lakes, whatever. But if it's not going to impact ability of the land to produce at its highest level, and that, to the full extent of that 125 acres, would there be a different formula that would be able to be used in that situation?
So Senator Kay, I know I'm not supposed to ask questions, but I think maybe talking about an easement rather than purchasing. the land.
More easement, but still in some cases where easements are in place, in order to get those easements, you have to go through eminent domain. So that's where I'm asking if there's a difference.
I think that's a different classification. You're not taking the land, you're using it. If you want to build a pole, put a pole there or something, you're still prohibiting them from using it. So this is my first shot at it, okay? And so when we had that issue back in 1999, what was disturbing about that issue the most was we spent thousands of dollars defending ourselves against an announcement from the railroad. And when we won, we couldn't get restitution. We couldn't have any opportunity to gather back our money. And so I think it's obvious that the landowner needs to have some kind of authority or some kind of ability to defend themselves without having to spend their own money. But as far as an easement goes, whatever needs to be done to make this bill work, I'm willing to try to do that.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Any other questions from the committee? I will say in 7 years, it's probably the best coherent argument me and you I've heard from you, and I'm just giving you a hard time. He sits in front of me and gives me a hard day every day. I have no questions. I like this bill. We have to figure out how to maybe help out with that issue. But thank you for being here. Are you going to be here for close?
I am, and I'm going to sit over there because I can hear over there and I can't hear back here.
Understood.
All right. Thank you.
First up, proponents. There with that great introduction. All right, we'll start with opponents. Welcome.
Chairman Wayne, members of the Judiciary Committee. My name is Chris Elliott, CHRISELLIOTT. I'm a senior staff attorney from Nebraska Public Power District. I'm here today in opposition to LB 394 as written. I am also testifying on behalf of the Nebraska Power Association, which includes all the municipal utilities, public power districts, and electric cooperatives providing electric service across Nebraska. Utilities which provide service broadly to the general public have the right of eminent domain. The acquisition of private property through condemnation should always be a last resort for the acquiring entity. Pursuant to the provisions of the United States and Nebraska Constitution, landowners are entitled to just compensation when their property is obtained for a public purpose. NPPD and our public power peers always strive to obtain necessary land rights on a negotiated voluntary basis. The vast majority of the land rights acquired by NPPD and other electric utilities in the state consist of easements for transmission and distribution lines. For the last 25 years, NPPD has successfully obtained voluntary easements at a rate of 98 to 100% for transmission lines. To my knowledge, NPPD has rarely, if ever, acquired fee simple title for facilities through condemnation proceedings. The rights acquired for and impacts of building an expressway are significantly different from those needed to build an electric line on the fringes of private property. In the case of ag lands, state law generally requires that electric utilities locate lines along section and half section lines to minimize impact to ag operations. The easements NPPD acquires allows farmers and ranchers to continue using the easement area for cropland and pasture as they had before the public infrastructure was added. LB 394, as proposed, would require electric utilities exercising eminent domain to compensate the landowner for the entire fair market value, fee simple, of the condemned property. We believe the scope and magnitude of compensation which would be required by LB 394 is not appropriate when easements are acquired, especially those preserving use rights for the landowner. Finally, the bill creates separate classes of landowners by providing for payment of damages in the amount of 2 times the fair market value for owners of agricultural land. If there is a legitimate claim to severance damages, that should be addressed under present law. Is it fair to compensate an ag landowner at 2 times the rate of their next door neighbors who happen to enjoy simply maintaining a residence on an acreage? Or should a property inside Omaha be compensated at half the rate ag land is simply because their property is not in a rural area? As it stands today, 76-1701 is intended to fairly compensate all classes of landowners equally and equitably for property acquired through eminent domain. We certainly appreciate the impact of eminent domain on the property owner who is the subject of the taking. We are willing to work with Senator Erdman and the committee to help ensure compensation required by eminent domain law is fair to all parties impacted.
Any questions from the committee? So what is fair?
I believe the statute that's in place right now is fair.
So if I take a piece of land out of income producing, is that accounted for in your just compensation?
So I'm not a professional appraiser, but I did talk to the appraiser that we typically use, and he said, yes, when he calculates, they have appraisal standards to use. And when the market value of the property is calculated for the purposes of making the offer, the just compensation offer, that is considered yes.
So why not just make it standard, like 4 times the income that is produced off of that property? Why have an arbitrary number of you can get two adjusters and they both come up with a different number?
So let me try to give an example. So when agricultural property is listed for sale, it's listed at market value. That market value presumably includes future production off of that property. And I think when you're evaluating on a market value basis, and there is a standard, market value is the standard that's used by the appraisers. I think that is already included in there.
Any questions? Senator Hyde.
Thank you very much. How often does MPPD pay for eminent domain? Or how often do you use the eminent domain?
So as I said, we strive to acquire all of our easements on a voluntary basis. 98 to 1, depending on the project, anywhere from 98 to 100% of our acquisitions are without going to condemnation. So at most, it's been roughly 2%.
So, and I'm just thinking about our own operation. So, and we have several electric poles that line our property as well. So how would you consider this apples to apples though, as far as a major highway or thoroughfare and light poles?
I would not.
I don't think of them as the
No,
same.
ma'am.
Okay, thank you.
What about the residential? What about the replacement value? Because the house may sell for 175, but you're not going to build a house that's the same.
Well, you can't build the same house, and this is just my opinion. You've got a 50-year-old house, you can't build it to the condition that it's in, a 50-year-old house is in. Of course, new, I would think, with the same square footage, same floor plan, I would imagine because you have new materials, it would cost more. I agree. I kind of look at it, I thought about this as Senator Erdman was speaking on that. It's similar, if you have a car wreck, an accident, someone else's fault, their insurance company doesn't pay you as much as we would like it to sometimes maybe, for the replacement value of the car. They pay you for the value of the car as it exists at the time.
And I understand that. If that bill was before me, I would change that too. Because at the end of the day, $1,000 car may be $1 million car to that person who's driving to take their family back and forth to school and to work. So
I agree.
So again, what about the replacement value?
Again, we'd be willing to talk to Senator Erdman about this and try to work something out. I can't speak for NPPD or the MPA to saying whether or not they would agree to replacement value. Right now, our standard, I think that we use is fair market value. Those are the appraisal standards also. It would probably require the appraisal standards to be changed if that were the case and the law were to be changed on that. But I can't speak for either my organization or MPA right now, whether we'd be willing to do that.
That's fair. Thank you. Any other questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Next opponent. Welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Senator Wayne. They don't usually let engineers come to this committee, so I'm kind of excited to be here. My name is Pam Dingman, P-A-M-D-I-N-G-M-A-N. I'm the current Lancaster County Engineer. Today I'm representing the Office of Lancaster County Engineer, the Lancaster County Commissioners, the Nebraska Association of County Officials, and the Nebraska Association of Highway Superintendents. I am testifying in opposition of 394. Lancaster County Engineering Department regularly completes construction projects such as road grading, road paving, pipe culvert replacement, box culvert replacement, and bridge replacements. It has been our experience when replacing old county bridges with new modern bridges that they are often longer, sometimes as much as 50%. Last year, we replaced a bridge on Agnew Road that was actually 90 feet longer than the old bridge. When we redesign pipe culverts, we have found that modern design requirements create the need for longer pipes. In addition, we put rock pads at the end of the pipes in order to slow down the water exiting the pipe. This practice keeps our creeks and drainage ways from getting wider and deeper, and hopefully can keep our bridges a little shorter too. Lancaster County also currently has projects in design for many widening projects on our paved roads to create a safer, wider, modern road cross-section. Nearly all of these projects require right-of-way to construct them. I have enclosed an example of a right-of-way track that is typical for our project, about 1/10 of an acre on each side of the pipe. Nearly all of the additional right-of-way we need for these projects is farm ground. Our right-of-way staff does everything they can to reasonably acquire farmland. However, we still typically have 1 or 2 tracts a year that go through the eminent domain process. Each tract goes through eminent domain, requires an independent appraisal report of its value, appraiser testimony, court fees, appraisal board costs, and Lancaster County staff costs. The cost can easily reach $10,000 per tract. It is our concern that if LB 394 passes, nearly all of our right-of-way would go to eminent domain proceedings if the landowners knew they could get double the land value. As previously stated, Lancaster County will purchase around 150 tracts this year in order to complete our construction projects. The majority of the tracts of land are farm ground. Our current budget to purchase these tracts is $162,000. The exhibit I have shared with you shows the cost of the right-of-way with LB 394 would reach almost $1.7 million, or more than 10 times the cost if these all went to eminent domain. The additional cost would be substantial to Lancaster County Engineering Department. In addition, this would create lengthy delays for all of our projects. This bill would create an unreasonable burden on our county construction projects. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Any questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you for being here. Next opponent. Welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon again, Chairman Wayne and members of the Judiciary Committee. For the record, my name is Elaine Menzel, E-L-A-I-N-E-M-E-N-Z-E-L, here today on behalf of the Nebraska Association of County Officials, and I'm also appearing in opposition for the Nebraska Association of School Boards on LB 394 for reasons previously identified by Ms. Dingman. And I would like to, this isn't the best way to show you the information or to talk about, but information was asked about market value and some of those issues. So I'll read to you what I was given for information from someone who is much more knowledgeable on this area. And essentially it's market value when calculated under an income approach capitalizes an income stream into the future. And then the cost is typically figured as a replacement cost, new, less the depreciation. With that said, I think that we would volunteer, as always, to work with Senator Erdman and members of the committee to perhaps address some of the concerns that he has, and hopefully that will help. If there's any questions, I would be glad to answer them.
Any questions from the committee? Senator Harbaugh.
Thank you, Chairman Wayne. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Do you have any idea how often, how many counties have had to use eminent domain and how many times?
I appreciate you bringing up that question, because I had intended to comment to the degree I know. We did do a survey and had about a quarter of the counties respond, and that there was only one county that showed that they had used eminent domain during, my guess is a year's time frame or something of that nature. So, and they ranged in, from the larger to the smaller counties. And as I said, it was just a quarter of the counties responded. So therefore, it's maybe not an entire good representation, but at least that's what we found out in short order.
Thank you.
Any other questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Next opponent.
Thank you, Chair Wayne, rest of the committee. I'm Kyle Hochschild, KYLE-HAUSCHILD. First of all, I'd like to thank you guys for letting me have an opportunity to speak in opposition to this. I represent the Nemah NRD and the Nebraska Association of Resources Districts. At the Nemah NRD, we operate and maintain over 460 watershed structures that make up the biggest stormwater infrastructure in southeast Nebraska. In the 1950s and 60s, the SES, now which is the NRCS, worked on watershed plans that are some of the oldest in the country, with Brownell Creek located east and south of Syracuse being the third oldest nationwide. The Nemah NRD's 460 structures are the most dams that are maintained by NARD in the state. As these structures start to age and get to the end of their design life, we are tasked with rehabbing or totally rebuilding these structures. The standard design life is about 50 years. We have some dams that are approaching 70 years old, which is good that they have outlived their design life, but it's time to fix them. The time has come, like I said, to put more work into these structures to make sure that they can make it another 70 years. When we start to look at doing this new work, land rights are always part of what is needed to complete the work. The dams that were built 40, 50, 60 plus years ago were designed to the standards and precipitation needs at that time. Advancements in engineering and modeling will likely change the footprint and the size of these structures to make them as effective as they were when they were first built. I'm asking for help from the Judiciary Committee and the state legislature to help my district's infrastructure, keep the infrastructure in place and the cost of these effective as possible. The entities operate mostly on tax funding and grant opportunities. We are tasked with keeping our tax requests as low as possible while trying to provide the public with the highest level of safety and flood protection possible. If LB 394 is passed, it will make it almost impossible to continue to provide the flood protection because it will make doing these projects unaffordable and non-cost effective to continue rehab and to reconstruct these structures. If these structures get to be too expensive to construct and past the point of repair, they will have to be decommissioned and all flood control benefits will be lost. The Nemah NRD is currently working on multiple watershed and flood prevention operations, which is WFPO through NRCS and is formerly known as PL 566, plans with NRCS to bring these structures up to today's standards. One part of the plan is to make sure that it's cost effective and work doing these projects. If the land values are doubled with this bill, it will make it unachievable to complete these structures because they will never check the box of being cost effective. If this bill is passed, it will take the negotiation power away from the NRDs and will force every project in the eminent domain and will drive the cost of the project up to do complete the service to our taxpayers.
Thank you. Thank you for your testimony.
Yep, I'll do that. Thank you.
Senator DeBoer.
Thank you. How often do you, is most of the, I would imagine all of the eminent domain that you're exercising is against agricultural lands or such things. How often do you ever come across residents?
Hardly ever. Honestly, when we cite a lot of the dams, they're usually away from residence areas. In the case of us, we're 95% rural, but they're mostly, not mostly, but a good portion of them are actually located above cities for flood protection purposes. above them. And I will say we hardly ever go in an eminent domain to acquire most property. It is negotiated. But like I said, the fear that we have with this is if this holds true and this bill goes through, that'll take the negotiation out of it because automatically people say, well, you can either negotiate with me or just double the price of what you're going to pay me and we'll go that route. So,
I mean, you could negotiate to pay twice as much.
and that's possible. But if it came down to that, we would just probably move on to the next structure upstream or downstream to locate outside that area. But if everybody's doubling the price of the property, we would never be able to afford to put in flood control structures.
Okay, thank you.
Senator Hobart.
Thank you, Chairman Wayne. Have you actually done any analysis of how much it's going to cost, additional costs? I mean, can you give me an annual impact?
We haven't. We're actually just in the first phases of doing our WFPOs. Again, in that Brown L structures or Brown L watershed that I talked about, there's about 110 structures and 25,000 acres. Again, that was the third plan that was ever done nationwide. So NRCS it was I guess a kickoff project where they kind of were guessing by galling a lot of those structures. Then and now we're tasked with maintaining them. So they weren't even ours. We adopted them without a better way of putting it when the NRDs were formed. But we still have to bear most of the cost of keeping those things up and running. So we haven't actually looked at it. Once we get through, we'll have a better idea of what our land costs will be if we're going to increase those or make them bigger or smaller, decommission, whatever it takes. So we have not done the initial studies on yet. We're working on that now.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Any other questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Next opponent.
Good afternoon, Chairman Wayne, members of the Judiciary Committee. My name is Vicki Kramer, VICKI-KRAMER, and I'm the Director of the Nebraska Department of Transportation. I'm here today to testify in opposition to LB 394. LB 394 impacts the state's abilities to condemn property through eminent domain by doubling the price of agricultural land and increasing other expenses associated with acquiring real property. It creates a requirement that the state entity condemning agricultural land for severance damages, which includes replacement costs of all dwelling, garages, barns, etc., as opposed to the fair market value. I want to take an opportunity just to summarize some of the comments that have been made today, rather than going through the rest today. I think we can all agree that eminent domain is the last resort. We want to make sure that we can pay fair market value for the land that's acquired to pay for highways. When we go about the right-of-way process, we typically try as a department to protect the right-of-way in advance, meaning you know where the roads are going long before they're actually being built that way. It's our intent to protect the landowner as well as the public to make sure that the roads go in the right place by engineering standards, as well as making sure that the public has the ability to access them. Typically, those are made long in advance. You can go back and see some of the plans from many years ago of what that looks like. In terms of protecting the right-of-way in our fiscal note, what I did when we were putting together the fiscal note is we typically spend about $15 million in right-of-way acquisitions every year. So I doubled that. And then took the 50%. So that's where you get the 7.5. If you look at increasing the overall cost and replacing at projected market, I didn't get into that because it's hard to actually estimate what that would look like. And so we understand the senator's intent, but what I can tell you is there will be a significant cost to the state that will impact our ability to deliver our program. So I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Any questions from the committee? Senator Dwarf.
Thank you, Senator. Director Kramer, about how much, do you have an answer about how much of your eminent domain powers get used as opposed against a structure, a house, a garage, etc., as opposed to agricultural land?
So if you look at residential versus typical just ag land, right? What we acquire every year, it's about 50-50.
50% residential,
50, yeah. So if you, just the way we divide it, 50% of what we would acquire in terms of rows is agricultural land.
And when you're doing the negotiation with a landowner, for the residential property, what is the measuring stick for that? It's not, is it replacement value? Is it fair market value? Is it?
Fair market value. It is a very calculated process. I don't have the details on it, but I can tell you fair market value. It's a pretty centric process in terms of making sure that we understand what the value of that home is so we can honor it.
And is the value, I guess, is that like, would I be taxed on that value, or is it a value that?
I can get you that information, Senator, in terms of how we break that down based on the plot of land as well as the structure on that land.
Okay, yeah, that'd be helpful. Thank you.
Senator DeKay.
Thank you. Director Kramer, I'm just thinking out loud. The other night was the first time I was on the new southern beltway around Lincoln. With that, how much of that structure was, what percentage did you have to use the eminent domain? I know you're new to this, but that was already built, but do you have any idea how much of that was, percentage of that was eminent domain? And if there was any residential or farm structures or whatever else involved in that process?
It's a good example because it's greenfield project. I don't have what went into eminent domain, what was just typical right-of-way acquisition and what had been protected. I will get that number for you in terms of what we had to go.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Any other questions from Senator McKinney?
So listening to your testimony, and I see how you mentioned that capital is a limited source. And I was curious, does DOT seek out other funding sources outside of state funds, like federal grants or things like that?
Absolutely. So about 40% of our funding is federal funding. And so if you look at just in terms of this particular conversation, right away is typically something that is pulled into our overall project cost. So it's not something we budget for outside of the department. It's a project by project basis, but absolutely we look at both state and federal funds for projects.
So you have somebody in your department that works to figure out what grants are out there?
Yes, we do. So we have, in terms of raise grants or other additional transportation related grants, we have a local assistance division that works with local communities, as well as with our own team. We have a strategic planning division that looks at how we essentially go in and we'll talk to the federal government on discretionary grants.
And I asked this question because a couple years ago it was either infrastructure bill or ARPA, I forget which one, but I think infrastructure, there was money set aside for reconnecting communities that were negatively affected by interstate system. And I tried reaching out to DOT, probably should have reached out to you, but I forget who I talked to about the reconnecting communities grants, because in my opinion, this money we're leaving on the table as a state that would help a community like mine and deal with the negative impacts of the interstate system. And I kind of didn't get a real answer as to why you guys were not seeking out that grant. Could you give me some clarification on that?
So I can speak to the grant in question you're talking about. It's a new program, and so it may have just been in its infancy and not had been published in terms of rules and how they were going to do it. I'd be happy to have that conversation with you. I think that nationwide, we've seen some very innovative projects that create great impacts to that community start to be funded through the program. So I'd love to have that conversation with you, Senator.
All right, thank you.
Well, since I'm not in transportation, so we don't get to ask you questions, how about that bridge across the Missouri that I've been trying to build for? Okay, I guess there's no answer to that. All right. No, thank you for being here. But one question I have is, with the federal dollars, those relocation requirements are different than state. Are you familiar with the difference in what they are?
What do you mean by?
So if you use federal dollars and you got to relocate somebody, there's federal regulations that would govern over our state regulations. Is there a difference, and how do they differ?
Are you talking about the NEPA process then?
Yeah.
I can break that down for you. It's a little bit more complicated. I don't have the breakdown of the right-of-way acquisition and the whole process in terms of the negotiation piece and what has to be followed, state versus federal. I can tell you that both processes, we typically have the same public involvement procedures where we talk to the communities and go in and make sure that we are essentially providing the right level of knowledge and getting the right level of comment back. So for example, if you were going to do a public meeting on a federal project and seek out public opinion to guide which way you were going to go with a project that would essentially impact how many people were relocated, all of that is dictated by NEPA. And so those public meetings we go into with a very fresh, completely unjaded opinion in terms of what is the right decision. We let engineering and the public kind of guide us, as well as environmental. So I can walk you through that process and make sure that I clearly
think, well,
distinguish.
the crust of the question is the, to the homeowner. I'm thinking more about homeowners. Is there a different cost underneath federal versus state?
Do you mean, do we pay more if it's a state job?
Correct, versus federal job.
I don't believe so, but I'll double check that.
Okay.
I don't believe there's any difference.
Any other questions? I can show you that Missouri Bridge route. We'll sit down and talk about it.
I'm very, very familiar with it,
It's a
Senator.
great idea. It's a
Very
great
familiar
idea.
with it.
It's the best idea I ever had. Okay. Thank you for your testimony today. Any other opponents? What? Wait, you're not supposed to be here. It's not urban affairs.
Hello, Senator Wade.
Hello, how are you?
I've missed you, so I've come here. My name is Christy Abraham, CHRISTY ABRAHAM. I'm here representing the League of Nebraska Municipalities. I don't want to be repetitive. I just want to say we agree with many of the things that were raised, previous testifiers opposing this bill. Municipalities, I think, occasionally will use eminent domain for ag land, sometimes for a water well or some other provision that we need to be outside the city. And so we are concerned about that 2 times amount for ag land. It will ultimately come back to the municipalities and the taxpayers and that municipality to pay for that. So we are concerned about that. Like the other testifiers said, the use of eminent domain, relatively rare for municipalities. Typically, a negotiated agreement can be worked out, but if eminent domain is needed, it's usually for something pretty important. So I'm happy to stop there and answer any questions you might have.
Any questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Any other opponents? Anybody testifying in a neutral capacity? Welcome back.
Good afternoon, Chairman Wayne, and members of the Judiciary Committee. My name is Kenneth Winston, KENETHWINSTON, appearing on behalf of Bold Alliance in a neutral position related to LB 394. We do strongly support just compensation for any property taken by eminent domain and believe that all aspects of property value should be considered. However, we are concerned about having a formula that requires double compensation. We think that this type of formula would create legal issues and could be subject to abuse. Our primary concern is with the use of eminent domain to benefit private for-profit enterprises. We would be glad to work with the committee to develop language to address these concerns. Thank you.
Any questions from the committee? All right, seeing none, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Anybody else testifying in a neutral capacity? Welcome.
Hi, I'm, good afternoon, Chairman Wayne and the members of the Natural Resources Committee, or actually Judiciary. I was just over at Natural Resources. Wasn't really
We're
planning.
way cooler.
I hope so. I wasn't really planning on testifying on this one, but I think did I spell my name? Did I do all that? I'm Melissa Keierleber, MELISSA KEIERLEBER. I'm here representing my family that's been farming near Gretna for almost 100 years, and we will be severely impacted by the state's desire to build a recreational lake. My family's farming operation has been under threat of eminent domain 2 other times. And when you're farming in bottom ground, the price you receive is neither just nor fair. Last year's LB 1023 put into motion where the state is potentially going to be in the business of building large recreational lakes, where flood control was the original goal of it, is now being completely looked over. There's less than 1% flood control in that bill, according to HDR and John Engel. And so now we have this conundrum where the state is going to probably be having to go up against maybe 6,000 acres that are going to be coming up against eminent domain. And it isn't for roadways, it isn't for bridges, it isn't for, telecommunications and all those things. It is strictly for recreation. So when I say it's the bare minimum protection for this bill, we're looking at losing houses, we're looking at losing livelihood, we're looking at losing, grain bins, elevators, all those things, and to try and go replace them, it's almost impossible to do, especially with ground prices being what they are now. So I encourage you to look at routes of protecting people for pipelines as well. That's another use that there isn't a common use case for those things. So I greatly appreciate your time, and I would be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Any questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Anybody else testifying in the neutral capacity? Seeing none, as Senator Erdman comes up to close, we have received 7 letters. For the record, 2 in support and 7 in opposition. Senator Erdman to close.
Thank you, Senator Wayne. I am surprised that I didn't get more opposition. I kind of expected Farm Bureau to come in and testify negative, but they're not here. So it was interesting. Some of them said that we're going to offer just compensation. Just a second, I turn the hearing aids down. Anyway, we're going to give just compensation. What is just compensation? So you also heard him say that when they buy ag land, that the appraisal is assuming future production is included in the price. That's not exactly the case. And so when they purchased land on that expressway north of my house, the land was worth about $700 an acre, and I think they gave them $900. And so that doesn't make up for many years of production. And most of the testifiers are talking about buying ag land, but this bill also protects structures and it's replacement costs for structures. And so the young lady that testified about the lake, those structures are going to be removed and taken away, and rebuilding those, they need to be compensated fairly. And I think replacement cost is more than fair. And as you listen to those people today, every one of those were representing a government agency that were paid to be here, or those people were here asking for protection for a government agency. So what has happened in the state of Nebraska is, in all states basically, is the government needs to have protection. And so consequently, you surely can't take that away, because the Department of Transportation director said, and I thought it was kind of ironic, she said in her testimony that capital, since capital is a limited resource, well, what does she think capital is to those people they're taking their property from? That's a limited resource as well. But it's okay for the state, the NRD, whoever wants to take this property in eminent domain, it's okay for them because their capital is limited. But the poor people they're taking it from that don't want to sell their property, we don't care if they're short of capital. It's just what we want. So every one of those people were paid to be here. So where were the people that are going to be affected by it? Where were they? They were home working, trying to make enough money to pay their property tax. And so we don't get a lot of representation from the lobbyist group for the landowners and the homeowners that are being taken by eminent domain. So we only have the public power, Lancaster County, NACO, NDOT, and the cities. That's it. I thought there'd be more than that. It aggravates me when we have put government and what government should do ahead of the people. I was elected by the people in the 47th district, 9 counties, to come here and represent their interests, to try to protect their interests, try to protect their personal property, their personal property rights, or private property rights. And I'm fighting against all the government entities who want to take their property and not fairly compensate them. So what if it costs the state more money to buy the land? What if it costs the county more money? Who cares? Okay? The point is, you don't care about those taxpayers. You don't care about those property owners. That's the issue. Do I expect this bill to go anywhere? Probably not. And it probably won't go anywhere because it doesn't have a priority. But this is the only conversation we're going to have about eminent domain. Because when I came here 7 years ago almost now, I made a promise to those people that we would work on property tax. And I've still been working on that. And until we get to the place that that's solved, I'll continue to do that. But I'm here to represent the people that sent me here in a way that they would be proud of me to do that. Those people going to be affected by this road that's coming by my house are worried. Those people are hurting. But it's for public purpose. Don't worry about it. You can build somewhere else, or you can move. It's time for us to put the taxpayer first for once. I appreciate you having me here today. Thank you.
And for the record, there are 7 letters, 2 in support and 5 in opposition. I guess it's 7. Any questions for Senator Urban? Well, you may get a priority. You never know.
Thank you, sir. By the way, I wanted to say this. Senator Wayne is the only individual I know, senator, that came in this first year, was a chairman the first year, and ever since has been a chairman. I know of no one else that's done that.
That's why I have a lot of gray hair. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
And that'll close the hearing on LB 394 and open the hearing on LB 379. Senator Conrad, we'll give a couple minutes for the room to clear out.
Well, I know how to clear out a room.
Yeah, you do. Welcome, Senator Conrad, to your committee.
Hello, Chairman Wayne, members of the committee. My name is Danielle Conrad. It's Danielle Conrad, CONRAD. I am here today representing the Fighting 46 Legislative District of North Lincoln. And I am proud to introduce LB 379 for your consideration. This measure would allow the non-use of a seatbelt in violation of a driver's duty to ensure children are properly restrained to be utilized as evidence in motor vehicle accidents. State statute section 60-6267 imposes the duty upon the driver of the motor vehicle to ensure that all vehicle passengers ages 8 to 18 use seat belts or other provided occupant protection systems. So in 2022, the Nebraska Supreme Court handed down a decision in Christensen versus Broken Bow Public Schools, wherein a coach was driving a van of high school students, athletes, and he had violated this measure, Nebraska Revised Statute 60-6267, by failing to ensure that the kids in the van had their seatbelts on. And a 17-year-old student athlete was unrestrained and he was a passenger, and then they got in an accident. And the young person sustained very significant injuries in that collision, injuries which might have been avoided or limited had the driver ensured the student was using his seatbelt as required under state law. The Supreme Court held that another portion of Nebraska's seatbelt law, section 60-6273, precluded the consideration of failure to use the seatbelt on issues of proximate cause and liability. So essentially, this measure is brought forward because I think the court got it wrong. And the court signaled to the legislature that we have an opportunity to clarify, update, and address this issue through subsequent legislation, which is kind of part of our separation of powers and checks and balances. So in talking with different stakeholder groups pre-session, I had a conversation with the Nebraska Association of Trial Attorneys. We were kind of working through issues that were top of mind for their members in terms of things that we might need to bring up to remedy in this legislative session. This issue spoke to me as a mom and seemed like a common sense measure to bring forward to ensure that injured families can receive some level of accountability and compensation, as I think the legislature originally intended, and I think the court misread in the 2022 decision. So with that, I'm happy to answer questions. Also happy to keep running around to all these committees I have this afternoon. And I know there's some really, really smart trial lawyers and other folks here who can go deeper with the committee if you so desire.
Any questions from the committee? Can you name that case again?
Yes, so it was Christensen versus Broken Bow Public Schools. And that was a 2022 Nebraska Supreme Court decision.
Thank you. Any other questions? Seeing none?
Also, don't tell the court too loudly that I said they got something wrong.
It is stricken from the record.
Yes. Okay. Thank you so much. Thanks.
Thank you. Will you be here for closing, or you just want to? Maybe.
I was planning to run back, but I can hang around if you need me.
First up, proponents. Proponents. Hello.
Good afternoon, Senator Wayne, members of the Judiciary Committee. My name is Mark Richardson, MarkRichardson. I'm here today to testify on behalf of the Nebraska Association of Trial Attorneys in support of LB 379. Senator Conrad hit on it. This is a legislative fix bill to a Supreme Court opinion that came down in the Christensen decision. This is a simple focus. This is keeping children safe and giving those children and their parents recourse to hold those accountable who don't. And that's what this seeks to do. We think that the Nebraska Supreme Court ignored some fairly clear legislative intent of this statute that by its black letter, we acknowledge the black letter of the statute that the Supreme Court relied upon says you can't use this type of non-seatbelt use as evidence of comparative negligence. But it totally missed the context of the fact that that was in regard to the adult seatbelt bill. It came in at the same time as the adult seatbelt bill, which said, okay, now we're going to mandate that people have to wear seatbelts. How are we going to use evidence of non-use of seatbelt in a personal injury action when somebody's hit by somebody else? A seatbelt has never, you'll hear me say this again later, a seatbelt has never caused an accident. And so the legislature rightfully came down and said, wait a second, you can't use a seatbelt as evidence of comparative fault. It was the other driver's fault. What a seatbelt does potentially is it mitigates damages. That's a different defense, mitigation of damages. And the statute as it reads right now says that's how you use it. You use it as mitigation of damages. The Nebraska Supreme Court in Christensen took that and said, well, it's not just mitigation of damages. It actually precludes any sort of claim being brought by parents of children who have had injuries like this. And I come back the same way Senator Conrad did, which is I have an 8-year-old. And if I put my kid into a car with another adult, and that adult said, in this car, we don't wear seatbelts. I would sure expect that if my kid is injured in a motor vehicle collision and they're ejected out of that vehicle and experience significant personal injury, I would expect I would have recourse against that. I cannot fathom the public policy argument behind why you wouldn't hold somebody accountable for that situation. And that's what this legislation is there to intended to fix, and we think it does it well. Happy to answer any questions you've got.
Any questions from the committee? Senator Ivar.
I have one. Thank you very much. So when you're litigating accidents and talking about what happened, how it happened, et cetera, do you use seatbelts as evidence? Do you say the child was not restrained, or anybody that might have been ejected from the vehicle were not wearing restraints?
The question of whether somebody was belted in comes up in every single case I've ever been involved in. The current statute that we have, when used appropriately as a mitigation of damages type defense, it fits where it's supposed to fit. It says that if you fail to use your seatbelt, that can be used against you to take your damages, which might otherwise be up here, and bring them down to here, but it limits it. It only allows you to reduce them by 5%. Again, that's an acknowledgement that the person that actually caused the collision is the reason you're injured. You didn't get injured because of your seatbelt. Your seatbelt was simply would have been a mitigating factor. So yes, Senator, it comes up in every case that we've had. Now, does that come in front of the jury in every case that we have? No, it doesn't. Largely because of the statute that we have right now. We just think that statute has now been taken a step beyond what it was ever intended to do, and that's what this bill seeks to fix.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions from the committee? Senator Duquette.
Back to the broken bow case just for a second. I remember the incident. What I don't remember for sure, was that a single car or was that a multi-car accident?
That was a multi-car accident. There was another driver that was involved that ultimately, I believe, was held responsible for that, but this was the two causes of action arising out of the same incident.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Senators.
Any other proponent? Proponent. See none. Opponents. Come on up, opponents. Welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman Wayne and members of the committee. My name is Patrick Cooper, PatrickCooper. I am a practicing attorney, have a civil litigation practice for approximately the last 20 years, and I'm a member of the Nebraska Defense Counsel Association. And we oppose this bill, not because we disagree with the fundamental premise of the bill, but rather because we think this bill doesn't go far enough and would create an unfair statutory framework. We all agree about the importance of seatbelt use, and I think the proponents of LB 379, as well as the proponents of the competing bill 472, agree on that point. And both bills really support the notion that seatbelt evidence should be more broadly admissible in civil litigation to prove issues of liability and proximate cause, and that juries are entitled to hear those sorts of facts when they're sorting out the issues that are unique to each and every individual case. But this particular bill, LB 379, really betrays its own logic. It would suggest that evidence that you may prove that a driver was negligent by failing to ensure that passengers were wearing a seatbelt, but you would be prohibited from proving that same driver was negligent for failing to wear his or her own seatbelt. This bill really says we would allow seatbelt evidence in some cases, but only for certain people and only for certain plaintiffs. And while we agree that seatbelt evidence should be more broadly admissible in litigation on issues like liability and proximate cause, we think this bill doesn't go far enough because it only makes that evidence available to a small group of litigants rather than to all Nebraskans who face these issues when they litigate these types of cases. I would just point out that the goals that are sought to be achieved by this particular bill would all be achieved by the passage of the competing bill, LB 472, which we think provides a more balanced approach to this issue and makes this type of evidence available to all litigants, not just a select few. I'm happy to answer any questions that any members of the committee may have.
Any questions from the committee? Seeing none. Thank you, Reed.
Thank you.
Next opponent. Seeing none. Anybody testifying in neutral capacity? As Senator Conrad comes up to close, we have no letters for the record. Senator Conrad to close.
Thank you, Chairman Wayne, and thank you to the committee for your thoughtful questions and to the testifiers, opponents, and proponents who came out today. There's no doubt that Senator Geist and I have kind of both identified an area that might need a little bit of work by this legislature moving forward. Our solutions are perhaps a little bit different, so that will be a policy choice for the committee to take up. I think there's no question her approach is a bit more expansive. Mine is a bit more narrowed and really focused on children. So I am happy to work with Senator Geist, proponents, opponents in this committee to figure out the best path forward, because I think we're all feeling like that Supreme Court case was perhaps really an indication to the legislature that we need to address this matter to ensure fairness for all litigants and all Nebraskans. Yeah.
Thank you. Any Senator Decay?
So just to make it clear, you and Senator Geist are willing to work together to combine both of these bills into one?
You know, I haven't had a chance to ask her about that yet, but I know that she's usually very collaborative in her approach. So I would be happy to follow up after the hearing if she's not here today, or just to keep putting our heads together to figure out the best path forward.
Yeah. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Any other questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you for being.
I just have one really easy question.
Senator Iba.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Children are up to age 18, correct?
I think that's right. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you,
Any
Mr.
other
Chairman.
questions? Seeing none, thank you for being here.
Very good. Thank
That'll
you.
close the hearing on LB 379. And now we will turn to LB 472, where I am going to introduce the bill on behalf of Senator Geist. Welcome, Mrs. Jacobson.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Wayne, and good afternoon, members of the Judiciary Committee. For the record, my name is Mary Jacobson, MaryJacobsen. Last year, traffic deaths in Nebraska increased by 15%. The state has not seen this many traffic deaths since 2007. Speeding, distracted driving, and failing to use seatbelts were the main causes for people to lose their lives. According to a study by the Nebraska Highway Safety Office in Nebraska last year, only 76% of drivers were wearing seatbelts. This is a 10% decline in seatbelt use since 2017. As of 2021, Nebraska's seatbelt use was in the bottom 5 states in the nation. Seatbelt use is the most effective way to prevent death and serious injury in a crash. Data from the CDC and National Highway Traffic Safety Administration show seatbelts reduce the risk of death by 45% and reduce the risk of serious injury by 50%. People who don't wear seatbelts are 30 times more likely to be ejected from a vehicle during a crash. More than 3 out of 4 people who are ejected during a fatal crash die from their injuries. Current law prohibits the admissibility of evidence at trial that a person in a motor vehicle was not wearing an occupant protection system or a 3-point safety belt, aka seatbelt. This current prohibition on the admissibility of evidence of seatbelt use has been in place for 38 years or since 1985. This was put in place when our understanding about the importance of seatbelt use was very different and not informed by the data I shared with you today. Due to the updated data, we have all seen the campaigns by Nebraska and the federal government to encourage people to wear their seatbelts. LB 472 would eliminate this prohibition and allow as evidence when any person in a motor vehicle was not wearing an occupant protection system or a 3-point safety belt to be admissible as evidence in any civil proceeding. Science and expectations surrounding seatbelts have changed immensely over the last 38 years. Occupants of a motor vehicle in Nebraska are required by law to wear a seatbelt. This prohibition in Nebraska statute has outlived its usefulness and purpose. It prevents parties to a lawsuit from presenting all relevant evidence to a jury. Increasing seatbelt use and modifying this prohibition to be more in line with modern rules of the road is critical to reduce injury and save lives. I'd encourage the committee's support of LB 472. There will be a few other testifiers following me that will be available to answer your questions.
Thank you. We ask questions of staff here, so. First proponent.
Good afternoon, Chairman Wayne, members of the committee. My name is Kent Grisham, K-E-N-T-G-R-I-S-H-A-M, and I appear today as the President and CEO of the Nebraska Trucking Association. For reference, the NTA is one of the largest state trucking associations in the country with more than 900 members representing motor carriers in Nebraska of all sizes and types. But we are more than just the for-hire motor carriers. My members are businesses of all types, farms and ranches that run trucks as part of their operations, as well as companies who fuel, service, and equip them all. My members make up a large part of the trucking industry, one that demonstrates its essentialness every day. Every one of us benefits from a safe and successful trucking industry. That is especially true in Nebraska, where about half of all of our communities receive everything they need by truck alone. No rail, marine, air, or pipelines, just trucks. With that background information in mind, I come before you today in support of LB 472, and we sincerely thank Senator Geist for bringing it forward. It is not fair that the owner of a motor vehicle, whether a commercial big rig or a personal minivan, should be held fully liable for the injuries to another driver when that other driver was negligent themselves when it comes to using a seatbelt. Yet in Nebraska, that unfairness is exactly what we have written in the statute. The unlawfulness and negligence of not using a seatbelt is a choice every driver in Nebraska can make for themselves. We need to stop supporting that bad choice by allowing plaintiffs to claim higher levels of damages after an accident when the severity of their injuries could have been dramatically lessened with a simple click. Judges and juries should be allowed to consider that evidence and decide what is fair in a courtroom. There is ample data that shows damage awards have grown at a rate far greater than inflation, including the inflation rate for healthcare. There is, of course, a clear correlation between that data and the cost of insurance for motor carriers. The average cost of truck insurance premiums rose 42% from 2010 to 2018, with the most dramatic cost increases hitting the small fleets, the 1 and 2 truck grain operators, the cattle and livestock transporters, and the owner operators. In fact, in terms of the cost per mile for insurance premiums, fleets under 25 pay quadruple the rate of fleets over 1,000 trucks. But in Nebraska, those small fleets and owner operators make up 85% of the trucks being operated in our state. We know that these issues are about more than costs. They are about people, many of whom have legitimate needs and claims following an accident. The trucking industry is not one that shirks responsibility, ever. We are only asking for fairness in terms of determining damages following an accident by allowing judges and juries to consider the use of seatbelts. LB 472 brings about that level of fairness, and we urge its passage. Thank you. And I got it in under the red light.
Any questions from the committee? So you think if this bill were to pass, your premiums would go down?
I don't think premiums will ever go down, but we can control the increases that we see. We can start as, beyond this issue, many issues, taking a look at the causes that are driving insurance rates, the way that port damages are being assessed. All of those things are worthy of consideration, and this is a great start.
Thank you. Seeing no questions, thank you for being here.
Thank you, sir.
Welcome.
Good afternoon, Chairman Wayne and members of the Judiciary Committee. My name is Robert Ed Bell. Last name is spelled B-E-L-L. I'm the Executive Director and Registered Lobbyist for the Nebraska Insurance Federation. I'm here today in support of LB 472. The Nebraska Insurance Federation is a state trade association of insurance companies. The Federation currently has over 40 member insurance companies. Member companies write all lines of insurance and provide over 6,000 jobs to the Nebraska economy and over $14 billion of economic impact to the state on an annual basis. Perhaps most importantly, the Nebraska Insurance Federation member companies provide high-value, quality insurance products that protect Nebraskans during difficult times. As you've already heard, LB 472 would allow the admissibility of seatbelt use in a civil action. The Federation contains members who write personal and commercial auto insurance, and this is a change that is long overdue in Nebraska. I'm going to highlight 3 points for your consideration. First, Nebraska insurance companies support any public policy that encourages seatbelt use. Driving is the single most dangerous thing that most Nebraskans do on a daily basis, and all Nebraskans should take steps to mitigate the risk involved. Buckling your seatbelt is one of the simplest and most effective ways to mitigate that risk, particularly with modern passenger restraint systems. If an individual chooses not to mitigate that risk and is involved in an accident, there should be consequences, which leads to my second point, fairness. In Nebraska, you can be ticketed for not wearing your seatbelt, in part because this legislature has decided that wearing a seatbelt is important. It seems fundamentally unfair to not be able to admit such evidence to a court. It should be the providence of the court or the jury to assess the evidence and distribute both fault and damages. It is a mistake not to wear your seatbelt, and that needs to be part of the case. My final point, will LB 472 reduce awards to victims who do not wear a seatbelt? Very likely, yes. Auto and liability insurers will have less exposure, no doubt. But there's always other insurers on the other end as well, involved in the financing of the injuries and damages, such as health insurers, disability insurers, and other liability insurers who are also Federation members. In fact, going into our legislative meeting, I was unsure of what the position of the Federation might be. But all insurers are invested in seeing less harm on the roads and support policies that encourage both highway safety and personal responsibility. For these reasons, the Nebraska Insurance Federation supports LB 472. Thank you for the time and the opportunity to testify.
Any questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you for being here.
You're welcome.
I would go in there. I don't know. Just... Next, proponent. Welcome.
Thank you, Chairman Wayne, members of the committee. My name is Patrick Cooper, P-A-T-R-I-C-K-C-O-O-P-E-R. I'm an attorney with a civil litigation practice, and I'm here today on behalf of the Nebraska Defense Counsel Association, which is in favor of LB 472 because we believe this bill represents progress that has been made in safety over the last several decades and provides a balanced approach to the issue of admissibility of seatbelt evidence. By way of brief background, the current seatbelt statute was enacted in 1985. So for the past 38 years, juries have been prevented from hearing evidence of seatbelt non-use when considering issues of liability and proximate cause in litigation. But a lot was different in 1985, obviously. In 1985, people smoked on airplanes. Children did not wear car restraints. Many Americans didn't wear seatbelts, and at that time, seatbelt legislation was viewed as government intrusion or government overreach. And fortunately, times have changed, and there's now broad recognition about the importance of wearing seatbelts and how that is the best way to prevent serious injury in motor vehicles. But unfortunately, our seatbelt law is still stuck in the 1980s, and we think we should bring this statute current to more accurately reflect those changes in social norms and societal views that have developed and evolved over the last 40 years. Although we encourage our friends and family members to buckle up, when they sit on juries, they're not allowed to hear about whether motorists were not buckled when they're evaluating issues of liability and proximate cause. And we believe seatbelt evidence should be treated like any other fact issue. We should trust juries. We should trust the fact finders. We should trust the process and allow them to sort out the significance of the failure to use a seatbelt in a particular case with the benefit of the unique facts and circumstances presented by that case. And I would just point out one more thing before I run out of time. The current statute allows seatbelt evidence to be used on a very limited basis with respect to a mitigation of damages defense. LB 472 would correct really a fundamental contradiction between the current statute and existing state Supreme Court precedent. The current statute allows the jury to give up to 5% consideration on mitigation of damages, but our state Supreme Court has stated quite clearly that mitigation of damages is a defense that only looks at post-injury conduct. May I finish, Chairman? Thank you. It only looks at post-injury conduct, and it's not supposed to look back at the conduct of the injured party prior to the injury or prior to the breach by the other party. And so the current statute as worded, which allows this evidence in a very limited way to be used on mitigation of damages, is completely inconsistent with how our state Supreme Court has defined the contours of that particular defense. So we ask that you vote for progress and vote for fairness and support LB 472.
Thank you. Any questions from the committee? So I got one. I mean, isn't it true that insurance and insurance defense have their own special rule when it comes to rules of evidence and what juries can hear?
I guess I don't understand the question,
Well,
Chairman.
you can't mention insurance in the jury trial.
That is true.
You can't say they're insured.
That is true.
So if we're going to be progressive, why not let the jury hear everything, since you trust the jury so much like I do?
The difference is that whether a party is insured or not isn't relevant to the issues of the party's respective negligence and the damages that were sustained by a party. This bill would allow relevant evidence in front of the jury so that the jury can actually consider the respective fault and compare the negligence of the various parties.
You don't think whether it's a company or an individual is relevant to what goes on in those proceedings and in the jury's mind?
Well, we have a pattern jury instruction that our courts give that specifically inform the jury that they're not to consider whether it's an individual or a corporate party, and they're to give the same consideration regardless of that fact. So I don't believe that is a relevant consideration.
We can change that, though, right?
You certainly could enact a statute that says courts should treat corporations and people differently.
No, I'm just saying maybe we should give the juror all the facts. Who's actually being sued, who's actually being held accountable. Let's just give them everything.
Well, and with respect to the issue that's before us today, LB 472, we agree with you that the seatbelt evidence should be before the jury and that evidence should be more broadly admissible.
Thank you. Any other questions? Seeing none, thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
Any other proponents? Any opponents? Should have just had a joint hearing. I'm here on opponent and proponent.
Senators, my name is Mark Richardson, MarkRichardsson. I'm here testifying in opposition to LB 472 on behalf of the Nebraska Association of Trial Attorneys. And appreciate your questions to Mr. Cooper. I've litigated with him on several occasions, and I can attest to the fact that he's very hard to pin down on some of those questions. So I feel your pain on that.
He's an attorney. He's an attorney. He's not supposed to.
I get it. Any indication that juries aren't allowed to take in that somehow we're ignoring seatbelt use is not the current state of the law. What we're saying is seatbelts have never caused a collision. When a drunk driver crosses the line and runs head on into a car, the seatbelt had nothing to do with it. And so for this legislation, the way this bill's written, it says you get to use the seatbelt information as a potential proximate cause of what happened to you. That is not right. This does feel more like a mitigation of damages question. And Mr. Cooper was exactly right. That's where we have this trouble, because seatbelt use precedes the actual collision, so it doesn't fit nice and clean into this mitigation of damages effort. But that's really what it is. And what the legislature decided, rightly, in 1985, is that we're not going to say the lion's share of the punishment goes on the person for not wearing their seatbelt compared to the drunk driver that hit them. It allows people, it allows defendants, it allows drunk drivers to muddy the waters and make things confusing for a jury as what is approximate cause and what isn't, and what's mitigation of damages and what isn't. And the way it's set up now gets it right. You're allowed to, if you don't use your seatbelt, you are going to be penalized for it. But you're only going to be penalized to a certain extent. If you take this away, you're going to end up with biomechanical experts in every case where the seatbelt's not going to be used. You're going to have expenses for these litigation efforts are going to skyrocket. You're going to see fewer settlements. You're going to see more trials because there's going to be more, it's just going to be a muddier picture and harder for people to agree what happened and how it should result. The statute as it exists right now works. It's not out of date. And I feel every time I get up here, I'm up here arguing for a bunch of people that don't have a collective. They're all injured Nebraska citizens, both past and future. And I'm up here arguing against multi-billion-dollar corporations and companies. And at some point, you've got to protect the victims. That's what the current statute does. And instead, this bill proposes is turning that around and saying, no, we're going to side with the drunk driver, and we're going to allow the drunk driver to attack the victim, and we don't think that's right.
Thank you. Any questions from the committee? You're thinking.
Yeah, I'm confused. We got people testifying on both sides of almost the same bill. I mean, same type of bill.
And hopefully I can, if you allow me, I can explain what we view to be the difference between those two. I mean, one, it comes down to our bill is about protecting the kids. It's about protecting direct allegations of negligence, of wrongdoing by somebody towards a third party. So if it's me, if I'm the one that's involved in the collision and I'm the one that's driving, those are my actions, those are my decisions to not mitigate my damages. If I have made that decision for a child who I'm in charge of, that is a very different liability analysis. And I should have an extra responsibility to that child. And if I fail in that regard, I should be held accountable. I think there's a clear distinction between those two. And that's why we're supporting 379 and opposing 472.
With this, when was the seatbelt law enacted? 83, 84, 85, somewhere in that?
85, I believe.
85. So it's a law that we're supposed to be wearing our seatbelts. And I agree with you 100% that in the case that was presented in the last testimony, that kids should be protected. Doesn't responsibility for those kids kind of land on the driver of the vehicle or who's ever in charge of those kids at the time, or passengers, regardless if it's kids in the vehicle? Do they bear any responsibility for that?
That was the entire Christensen case. It was the driver should have had responsibility to make sure that kid's buckled in.
I guess where I'm confused is we're trying to look out for the passengers, and who's ever not wearing a seatbelt is essentially breaking a law that's been put in place since 85. They should bear some of the responsibility for breaking that law, but it still doesn't take away, and hopefully not every case is a drunk driver. but it still doesn't take away the opportunity to go to court with the drunk driver on the charges of pending whatever those acts.
And I think that's right. I think if you look at the Christensen case is a perfect example. There was another car involved in that, and that other car is the one that crossed the center line in that case. If you were going to compare the two negligences between the guy that crossed the center line and the person that failed to buckle the kids in, I don't think there's a real strong comparison there. I think you're going to find everybody's going to agree that the person that crossed the center line is more negligent there. But that doesn't mean that the grown-up that was in charge of those kids wasn't negligent. And so the 379 bill addresses that situation, but it's not the same thing as coming in and saying, being able to argue, wait a second, for that same truck driver in that same situation, come in and argue, actually, you driver, you're more responsible for your own injuries. I didn't cause those injuries by crossing the center line. You did. That it's a fundamental difference in comparative fault analysis, which is what 472 would do, versus the current state of the law, which is it speaks more in terms of mitigation of damages, which again does reduce. There are consequences for that person that didn't wear their seatbelt. They get their damages lowered. Now, if we want to sit here and say 5% is not the right number, we'll work with the senator on finding the right percentage. But there should never be a situation where it's determined that the failure to use the seatbelt was more of the cause of the collision and the consequences than the person who injured them in the first place. And that's what 472 opens the door to.
Where we're at, if somebody crosses the line, whoever it is, passenger, motorcycle, semi, whatever, they're going to have to bear some responsibility because of the action that's taken, obviously. But the other part of it is it still goes back and hopefully it's not a life-taking event, but if it's injury, those injuries could have been prevented by them not having a seatbelt on. Doesn't that fall on the responsibility of either it's a grown-up in the vehicle that chose not to wear that seatbelt, or it's a person in charge of the minors does any of that responsibility fall on them?
It does fall on them, and that's why the current statute allows for the mitigation of damages. It allows for that percentage that they can recover to be reduced. But if you turn it into what 472 is, which is a pure comparative fault, and you would have a situation where you have a jury who comes in and says, well, it's 50-50. Yeah, 50% of the responsibility for the collision was on the other driver, but 50% was because you didn't use your seatbelts. In that situation, you'd recover zero. On a comparative fault in Nebraska, you would recover zero. And that can't be, the seatbelt didn't cause the collision. The seatbelt didn't cause the injury. The force of impact from the other vehicle did. And this is that's a small mitigation of damages issue that should never wipe out somebody from recovering. And that's what 472 would do. And that's why we're so strongly in opposition to making it as expansive as they want it to be made. We're open to working on it. We're open to improving it to make sure it reflects reality. But it shouldn't be a situation where you can just wipe somebody out because somebody else's negligence hurt them.
And I agree with you on a lot of it. Still, the extent of the injury still might fall some on the person or minor or whoever it is. That responsibility still falls on who's ever in charge, whether it's a consenting adult, whether it's the extent of the injury, some of that, it falls on the fault of whoever caused the accident. But the other part of it, if the extent, it's not going to eliminate the accident or the injury, but it's still going to impact on how bad that person was hurt one way or the other going forward.
And yes, sir. And the current state of that statute accounts for that and says, if you do that, if you don't have your seatbelt on, you're not going to be able to recover the amount of damages that you otherwise would have been able to recover because you failed to wear your seatbelt.
I'm done. Thank you.
Oh, I just heard the wrong pause, so I thought you were done. I apologize.
That was my brain thinking.
We'll come back to you.
Thank you. So this is really simple, and everything that you've explained to us is great. But if safety is the issue, and we're going to use that to litigate, shouldn't we encourage all occupants of a car to wear their seatbelt?
Absolutely, and I think we do. It's why you get punished you're not able to recover the full amount of your damages if you don't wear your seatbelt. The statute already says that. So that's absolutely true. I will say, just from a practical standpoint, as I was sitting back there listening to that argument about we should encouraging people, I have a hard time believing that anybody gets into a vehicle and I understand they might get in the vehicle and think, I better put my seatbelt on because if a police officer sees me, I get pulled over. I have a hard time buying the argument that anybody's ever gotten into a vehicle and said, I better put this seatbelt on because if somebody else crashes into me and I try to sue them later on, I might not be able to recover the full amount of my damages. I guarantee you nobody's ever had that thought when they get into a vehicle. That's not a practical way to think about what we're trying to accomplish with which basically is an evidentiary law in civil litigation.
Thank you. Thank you.
Go ahead. I mean, I might be thinking about this wrong, so I may ask the wrong question. So, like, let's take somebody who has diabetes. Clearly, they weren't eating too healthy, weren't doing those things, but they get in an accident, they get a cut, and the wound doesn't heal. Right? So you have to get another surgery. I mean, don't we have a principle? You find the person as they are.
That's the eggshell plaintiff rule, and that's exactly what it is. It is you take the injured person as you find them. You don't get a break. For example, if I'm perfectly healthy, but the person next to me has that condition, if their injuries are worse, even though they're in the same exact collision and would have otherwise had the same exact injuries, but their medical bills are worse because they had all these medical conditions, you're responsible for that person and everything that goes along with them. That's called the eggshell plaintiff rule, and that is the standard in Nebraska.
Since the beginning of time. Right?
Yep, common law.
So, I mean, we're kind of saying the same thing, right? Like, just because the person didn't have the seatbelt on, you don't get to determine. It doesn't supersede everything else. That's what you're trying to say.
Right. The principal reason the person is injured is because somebody else ran into them, not because they weren't wearing their seatbelt. A seatbelt would have only limited the damages. It wouldn't have eliminated the damages.
And you don't get to stand up, or the other side doesn't get to stand up in court and say, but for their diabetes, that extra surgery wouldn't have happened. Therefore, it's not relevant.
That's correct.
I've never seen a judge.
And I will say right now, with the statute the way it is, if you go into the courtroom and you don't agree to reduce your damages by 5%, then you are allowing the other side to put on evidence of what the seatbelt use would have done. So, I mean, there's a way right now, I mean, practically speaking, you're going to go and say, okay, well, we'll take the 5% discount and clear up that confusion for the jury.
Right. Any other? You're thinking, so. You want to take a recess and come back and ask a question? Thank you. Seeing no questions, no other questions, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Senators.
Any other opponents? Anybody testifying in the neutral capacity? Seeing none. We have one letter of support for the record, and that will close the hearing on LB 472 and the hearings for today.